Back in episode 24, I covered Maximum Carnage, and while I could appreciate the music, I had serious issue with just about every other aspect of the game. Surprisingly, it sold well enough to greenlight a sequel. In November of 1995, Acclaim released their follow-up just as Sega was putting the Genesis to rest. So, how was it in comparison to its predecessor? How does it compare across the platforms it was released on? And how is it in its own right as a beat-em-up? This is Retro Impressions, and we are looking at Spider-Man, Venom, Separation Anxiety. Much like the other Acclaim-made Spider-Man games, Separation Anxiety is based on pre-existing stories. It's not uncommon for people to think it's based on the series by the same name, but oddly enough, that's not the case. Separation Anxiety is actually a sequel to a book called Lethal Protectors, and that's the book this game is loosely based on. The story isn't great, but I'll fill you in. A group called the Life Foundation has kidnapped Venom and extracted 5 symbiote spawns for the purpose of binding them to 5 new hosts. Venom escapes and tracks down Spider-Man, asking him to help take down this new threat. You start off in the streets of New York in what looks to be a nearly identical level with identical enemies to the start stage in Maximum Carnage. Thankfully, the end boss is a digger machine and not a generic henchman. The story here is laid out via pages of text that follow the completion of each level. I actually miss seeing the comic book panels because the story really isn't interesting on its own. From there, you head to upstate New York in a stage that plays out across the bridge. Although I'm not going to hit on all the differences from comic to game, one I found interesting is the original story takes place in San Francisco. Anyways, this level does 2 interesting things. It's the only stage that gives you a reason to swing from your web, as it's required to cross the missing portions of the bridge. It's also the introduction of a new henchman called the Foundation Soldiers. As unreal as this is going to sound, you will only fight Foundation Soldiers with color palette swaps and occasionally 2 different robots for the remainder of the game. Don't get me wrong, there are still bosses, but there are plenty of stages where you will only fight 50 waves of Foundation Soldiers before reaching the end. In all fairness, it's the same way in the comic, but it was an awful idea to carry this over into a game. In fact, it's not just awful, it's shameful, because Separation Anxiety is only inspired by the comic, and choosing to follow this aspect is a misstep that's devastating to the end product. At the end of the bridge is a member of the jury called Sentry. You could think of the jury as a special ops group with Iron Man-like armor. Throughout the game, you'll encounter Bomb Blast, Ram Shot, Screech, Firearm, and Whisper. If you're clueless as to who they are, it's because they really haven't appeared in much outside of this storyline. From there, it's into the forest where you encounter the first symbiote called Riot, who can be defeated simply by holding your shield while facing him. A few more encounters with the jury lead to the second symbiote called Scream, who happens to be on the game's cover. Your next encounter is Riot and Scream together. After exiting the ventilation system, you enter what the game refers to as the Foundation Sanctum. These levels are poorly thought out and violate one of my biggest pet peeves in gaming. The view of your character is constantly obscured, as are the enemies, by unnecessary objects in the foreground. Who thought it was a good idea to put in obstacles that visually block the playfield from view? While I feel every acclaimed Spider-Man game would make a top 10 list for worst level design on a 4th generation platform, these stages are the worst of it. At the end of this mess, you face the 3rd symbiote, Phage, who is one of the easiest opponents in the entire game. In fact, most of the boss fights are fairly simple and they all have low health. This is something that's a substantial change when compared to Maximum Carnage. Another shallow level leads to Agony, the 4th symbiote. Once you're done here, it's time to head into the Sanctum and battle it out with more members of the jury. Honestly, this game isn't interesting to talk about because it's mostly the same experience from start to finish. To compound this, the page of text you receive level after level rarely mentions anything relevant as to what's going on. To give an example, it's only at this point in the game that it even mentions that you've taken down any of the 4 symbiotes and are looking for the remaining one. Well, that's nice to know. Of course, this leads to the final showdown with the last remaining symbiote, Lasher. The page of text that follows notifies you that everyone has been taken down and the game is essentially over. Or is it? Seriously, how dumb can this get? Carnage is on the cover of the box and was included in the game's advertisements. Of course the player knows it's not over. Up next is a boss rush featuring everyone you were just told was defeated. If you can muster the nerve to play up to this point, you will reach Carnage with ease. Once you've dispatched him, that's game. There isn't anything else to discuss story-wise because there is no ending. All you get for your hard work is a scroll of the credits, and you're returned to the title screen. So, what's the best version on a home console? The SNES and Genesis version both have their advantages. The soundtrack has a heavy electronica influence, something Sega's Yamaha chip excels at, and it's no exception here. Even if it's on the short side and fairly unmemorable, the music is crisp and sounds fine for what it's trying to do. The real issue with this style of music is how the SNES deals with it, and for the most part it does a terrible job making it almost sound hollow and incomplete. Graphically, it suffers from the same issues as Maximum Carnage. The SNES version is again noticeably darker, while the Genesis receives a very low resolution and pixelated background that just looks awful. I can't think of a valid reason for this, as the game's backgrounds are about as detailed as something you would expect to find on the regular Nintendo. Game-wise, they are identical. The game also received a PC release, and it's by far the worst of the three, to a degree that I'm not even going to discuss it further. For all this game's faults, it gets a few things right that Maximum Carnage dropped the ball on. First off, it includes a 2-player option, and as a brawler is a welcome addition. The one continue has been removed and is replaced by a password save feature. This was greatly needed because getting through this game is a chore of patience, as playing it grinds you down to an almost stupid-like condition due to the repetitive and shallow nature of everything it has to offer. It's honestly one of the most frustrating experiences on a 4th generation system that doesn't suffer from broken gameplay mechanics. The frustration comes from the artificially extended gameplay that wears out its welcome well into the first few minutes of Stage 2. It's almost as if the developer forgot that they had filled every stage past the first one with the same enemy placeholder, then accidentally shipped the wrong version. It's a mess and it's absolutely maddening to play. Lack of enemy variety was something I thought would be impossible to top after playing the first game, but this is a worse offender than Maximum Carnage. Let's look at some common complaints people have, starting with the graphics. There seems to be a consensus that the graphics in this game are a major step backwards in comparison to Maximum Carnage. This mostly has to do with the change in the art direction and the removal of the perfectly recreated comic book panels. Personally, I don't really see it as a step down, it's just a step in a different direction. That is, unless we're talking about those low resolution Genesis backgrounds. That's another story. Although I agree there are some major issues in separation anxiety, it's nothing new to the series. This actually leads me to my next issue. Both Maximum Carnage and separation anxiety rate about the same when averaging the vast majority of reviews available for each game. Some people love them, others like myself hate them, then there's a third group, and that's people who love Maximum Carnage and hate separation anxiety. Honestly, I don't know how it's possible to like one without liking the other. Speaking strictly of the reviewers who love Maximum Carnage yet hated this game, every single problem they cite in separation anxiety is present in Maximum Carnage. That is, with the exception of the comic book panels being excluded. Maybe it's selective memory because these two games are near identical in quality and gameplay, making any argument as to why one is good while the other is bad seem silly. In the end, you might be wondering what game in this series is the better of the two. Being I hate them both, it's really hard to recommend either, but it's not hard to definitively state that separation anxiety is the better option. I want to note both of these games are quite playable and don't have issues in the way they control, yet only separation anxiety has a 2-player mode, along with a whole host of obscure villains you almost certainly will never see in a game again, making it worth experiencing for hardcore Spider-Man fans. Unfortunately, these good controls can't fix the game's apathetic design, resulting in something I can't recommend. As I've played through the acclaimed Spider-Man series, I couldn't for the life of me figure out why people are passionate about these brawlers to the point that they actually recommend them to people who are inquiring about great beat-em-ups. Maximum Carnage and Separation Anxiety really are some of the worst examples of the genre each console has to offer. I think the love people have for these games comes from a sense of nostalgia that most have never challenged all these years later. If you have great memories of these games, leave it at that, because it's almost guaranteed that your tolerance for terrible games isn't the same as it was 23 years ago. Thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a positive or negative comment letting me know your thoughts. Click subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. If you're interested in staying updated on upcoming projects and channel news, follow me on Twitter. Until next time, I'm Jenovi and this has been Retro Impressions and Reviews.